All right, let's turn back to the White House and President Trump's decision to raise tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from 25 to 50%.
On the other hand, there are a lot of automakers that are in serious trouble, also because of these tariffs. Stellantis, Nissan, and they have to discount, right? They have cars sitting on lots for 90 days, for 100 days at Ram, 107 days of inventory.
Canada has taken note of President Trump's comments regarding the doubling of tariffs on steel and aluminum, saying that in the face of the economic threats posed by the United States, Canada remains resolute in defending our workers and communities.
Trump has just doubled tariffs on aluminum and steel from 25% to 50%. A move framed as protection for American industry has instead unleashed a wave of disruption across the economy. Almost immediately, manufacturers were hit with soaring costs. The projected impact, an additional $50 billion in import expenses, nearly twice what businesses were already struggling to absorb. But the financial strain wasn't the only consequence. Within weeks, over 100,000 American jobs vanished, concentrated in sectors like auto manufacturing, construction, and heavy machinery. For context, the original 25% tariff, introduced in 2018, took months to erase 75,000 jobs. This time, the damage was sharper, faster, and far more difficult to reverse. Factories didn't wait for relief. They laid off workers, paused expansion, and began shifting operations overseas. Yet Washington stayed silent, as if this economic fallout was either unexpected or somehow acceptable. Which raises the question, what really just happened, and why does it feel like America is punishing itself? Quick favor before we continue. Give this video a like so more people see what's really going on. The impact didn't stop at job losses. It spread factory by factory, sector by sector. Alcoa, one of America's largest aluminum producers, put it bluntly, you can't restart a smelter with a promise. Restarting domestic capacity isn't as simple as flipping a switch. Once the supply chain cracks, it's expensive and slow to rebuild. So companies reacted in the only way they could, by cutting costs. Layoffs swept through the industrial heartland. Some manufacturers relocated to cheaper markets. Others simply scaled back production. But nowhere is the pressure more visible than in the electric vehicle industry. EVs rely heavily on aluminum 2 to 3 times more than traditional gas-powered cars. That makes them especially vulnerable to input shocks. Tesla, Ford, and Rivian have all felt the squeeze. Higher material costs are now forcing delays, cancellations, and repricing, right as they're trying to scale in a fiercely competitive global market. Smaller startups have it worse. Several have already shelved plans for compact models and quietly shifted their sourcing to Canada and Europe, where aluminum remains cheaper and more stable. The result? America's industrial policy is now hurting the very sectors it once promised to protect. If this is resonating with you, consider subscribing. This stuff isn't going away anytime soon. And the challenges for American manufacturers don't end with tariffs or raw material shortages. They go deeper, right into the infrastructure that powers the industry. Aluminum is one of the most energy-intensive materials on Earth. Producing it at scale requires massive amounts of electricity, making energy prices a critical competitive factor. This is where the U.S. is falling behind. While American producers in places like Kentucky and Ohio face electricity costs above 10 cents per kilowatt-hour, Canadian smelters, especially in Quebec, benefit from abundant low-cost hydroelectricity paying as little as 4.5 cents per kilowatt-hour. That difference isn't just a number, it's a decisive advantage. In a business where profit margins are razor-thin, Canada's lower energy costs allow it to keep production steady, even as prices fluctuate globally. Meanwhile, many U.S. producers are forced to idle capacity, unable to compete unless government subsidies or tariff walls intervene. This structural imbalance is now reshaping where the world gets its aluminum and who gets left behind. While the U.S. tightened trade barriers, Canada chose a different path, not confrontation but acceleration. There were no threats, no counter-tariffs, no fiery speeches. Instead, Canada quietly ramped up production and expanded its export footprint, focusing on markets in Europe and Asia that were looking for stable, cost-effective supply chains. With its energy advantage already in place, Canadian producers didn't need to match America's rhetoric. They just needed to meet rising global demand. The result? As U.S. exports stumbled under self-imposed costs, Canada stepped in to fill the gap, solidifying its role not just as a North American supplier, but as a global alternative. This wasn't retaliation, it was strategy. As tariffs drove up costs and policy instability deepened, global manufacturers began making quiet but decisive moves, not in protest, but in pragmatism. Many of the world's largest consumers of aluminum, automotive giants like Toyota and Volkswagen, aerospace leaders like Airbus, and industrial conglomerates from Japan to Germany, started to quietly exit the U.S. supply chain. This wasn't about dissatisfaction with quality, nor was it a rejection of American innovation or know-how. It was about risk management. In a world of just-in-time production and razor-thin margins, buyers could no longer afford to tether their operations to a market so exposed to political volatility. From sudden tariff hikes to erratic trade policies, Washington was no longer seen as a stable partner. Every policy shift sent ripples through global cost structures. So they pivoted to Canada. With cheaper hydro-powered energy, a transparent regulatory environment, and a government actively investing in long-term industrial certainty, Canada quickly emerged as a preferred sourcing hub. Contracts that had once defaulted to U.S. suppliers were quietly renegotiated. Multi-year deals were signed with Canadian smelters. Logistics routes were redrawn, diverting containers from U.S. ports to Saguenay, Vancouver, and Halifax. Some manufacturers even restructured production footprints, relocating North American operations to align with Canada's supply flow. And while this shift unfolded without headlines, its implications are enormous. America, once the industrial anchor of North America, is now increasingly viewed as a volatile node in global supply chains, too unpredictable for long-term planning. This wasn't a momentary market reaction. It was a systemic rewiring, a structural shift in the flow of capital, contracts, and credibility. And in global trade, once trust is lost, it doesn't return easily. Rebuilding these relationships could take years, if not decades, and by then the world may have already moved on. But Canada isn't just capitalizing on the short-term fallout of U.S. tariffs, it's laying the foundation for long-term dominance. In provinces like Quebec and British Columbia, governments and private industry are pouring billions into next-generation aluminum production, aligning industrial growth with global environmental standards. At the center of this effort is ELYSIS, a joint venture between Alcoa and Rio Tinto, backed by Apple and the Canadian and Quebec governments. ELYSIS represents a technological leap, a carbon-free smelting process that uses inert anodes instead of carbon-based ones, producing oxygen instead of greenhouse gases during aluminum production. It's not just a cleaner method, it's the first of its kind anywhere in the world. But this isn't just a story of innovation, it's one of strategic alignment. As climate regulations tighten across Europe, Japan, and South Korea, demand is rising rapidly for low-emission traceable materials, especially in sectors like automotive, aerospace, and consumer electronics. Canada is positioning itself early as a trusted, transparent supplier to meet those new standards. Already, memorandums of understanding have been signed with the European Union, laying the groundwork for future trade in green-certified aluminum. These agreements aren't just diplomatic gestures, they are signals to global investors that Canada is serious about dominating the low-carbon materials market. And the ambition is clear. By 2030, Canada isn't just trying to be a top exporter, it wants to be the world's benchmark for sustainable aluminum, not merely outcompeting other nations on price or scale, but on climate leadership, traceability, and industrial credibility. In an era where carbon becomes currency, Canada is building its own competitive edge, kilowatt by kilowatt, shipment by shipment. As global supply chains shifted, the physical infrastructure that underpins cross-border trade began to reorganize in parallel. With tariffs inflating the cost of imported aluminum, key U.S. ports like Baltimore and Houston experienced a sharp decline in volume. These ports, once critical hubs for incoming metal shipments, now saw containers rerouted or canceled altogether. The aluminum that once flowed through American terminals supporting jobs, transportation contracts, and warehouse activity was increasingly bypassing the U.S. coast. Instead, Canada's port infrastructure rose to meet the moment. In Saguenay, a once sleepy terminal in Quebec, aluminum shipments surged as the region ramped up production. Farther west, Vancouver saw increased trans-Pacific flows, taking advantage of strong trade relationships with Asia and efficient customs protocols. Both ports benefited not only from proximity to production sites, but also from policy stability and global trust in Canada's export reliability. Even American logistics firms were forced to adapt reluctantly, redrawing their maps. Facing a fractured supplier base and erratic sourcing costs, Many began rerouting their own cargo through Halifax, Canada's eastern port. The shift meant longer transit times, higher fuel costs, and complex regulatory coordination, none of which U.S. manufacturers were prepared for. The downstream effects were immediate delivery timelines, stretched shipping rates increased, and American factories already struggling with elevated input prices found themselves stuck in a web of delays and uncertainty. This wasn't just a short-term disruption. It marked a structural redirection of trade routes, one that reduced the strategic utility of U.S. ports while boosting Canadian influence over North American logistics. In the end, this wasn't merely a miscalculation in tariff policy. It was a geo-economic pivot, a quiet yet profound reordering of how and where industrial power moves. By every measurable metric, the outcome is no longer theoretical. It's happening now in plain sight. In just a matter of months, the United States has seen over 100,000 industrial jobs vanish, many from regions already grappling with decades of deindustrialization. Aluminum producers, once the backbone of U.S. manufacturing strength, are now contending with shrinking order books, escalating energy costs, and a loss of global confidence. Meanwhile, just across the border, Canada is accelerating. Its aluminum output rose by 12% in the first quarter of 2025, driven by access to low-cost hydroelectricity, long-term export strategies, and a deliberate focus on industrial resilience. The contrast couldn't be sharper, where American facilities are scaling back shifts and mothballing equipment. Canadian plants are adding capacity and expanding payrolls. It's not just production, it's the ecosystem. Shipping lanes are being restructured. Investment capital is moving north. And Canada's partnerships with Europe and Asia are tightening around a vision of clean, reliable supply chains, something the U.S. is increasingly failing to guarantee. This is not a headline-grabbing crisis. It's a slow bleed, a quiet war waged through contracts, electricity prices, and the credibility of long-term policy. And that leaves a deeper question on the table. Is this a course we continue out of strategy, or simply because we no longer know how to turn back? Because when protection turns into isolation and strategy gives way to short-term politics, the fallout doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, in layoffs, in supply chains lost, in global influence fading. And if these warning signs are already this visible, what comes next? Appreciate you watching till the end. If this was worth your time, like and subscribe. There's a lot more unfolding beneath the surface.